Jordan's son is the Chief Innovation Officer of the City of San Jose, an Army Tech Scout, Squadron Commander, and a Major in the U.S. Army. In this conversation, we explore the directions the future could take us and how to move towards a better one. This podcast is sponsored by me. Go to joshterryplays.com to check out more of my work. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
So I want to start with a little bit of your military background. Could we start there? I mostly want to explore cities and the future and what can happen there. But could you tell us the context of where you came from in this?
Yeah, I joined the city during the pandemic. As someone who grew up in a marginalized community, I'm originally from Texas, born in South Texas in a small town called Harlingen, which is, just a stone's throw away from the border of Mexico, and then spent most of my childhood in Houston. And, I grew up in a community that's predominantly of color, predominantly immigrant. Often English is the second language. And so that really shaped my perspectives around equity. And, when I went off to college to study business, that further because that perspective constantly intersected with my understanding of economics, of commerce, and then eventually of technology. Um, I found my way to the military. My father was in the Army. He was drafted during Vietnam. Was very fortunate to ended up being sent to Korea because the Vietnam War ended. And so he served in the infantry as an officer. And that really gave me some ceiling in terms of, what I wanted to do in terms of when I think of an adventurous career. And then when I was of age to serve, I felt that this was my nation's war. I felt that it would be unfair and not do justice to the other families who sent their young sons and daughters into combat. And so I decided to raise my hand, join up first in ROTC, fulfill the obligations that I promised my parents to finish college, and then subsequently also commissioned in the Army as an officer, as now a second generation infantry officer, and to give back to my nation's fight.
Was English a second language for you?
No, English was not a second language for me.
Okay.
I was very fortunate. Actually, weirdly enough, I think my parents told me that my first words were in Spanish because, I grew up in a 95% Latina
Yes.
community, and we were the only Asian family there. So, um, my dad had to speak some Spanish in order to get along. I think his identification on his card at one point for his state ID was Roman Catholic, and so everybody basically was Catholic and some Latino heritage down there, except for us.
The way that you look at the world in terms of doing your part in the military, that viewpoint has it goes in and out in different generations, it seems like. And do you know what leads us to develop those particular values versus other generations where people might not value that as much?
I always think it's almost inherently American in us to have that sense of service in other
Mhm.
in the service of others, and in particular, the search for a greater purpose. And maybe it started in the 70s and 80s with this whole, spiritual understanding of self-awakening with the social movements that had happened, coupled with the civil rights movements and the music that was involved. I think it furthermore is exacerbated amongst millennials as we grew up asking ourselves, and I think obviously Gen Z takes it to the next level. Um, but I think most millennials very much remember 9/11 as a defining moment in our lives amongst the several recessions that occurred. When I look at Gen Z, and we hire a lot of younger technologists, you know, these folks, these young professionals are so civically minded and so interested in giving back. But rather than giving back, in the form of just joining the military, deploying, in serving in combat zones, they instead think like, how can I give back with the hard skills that I have directly to my local community? And so they're very civically minded, they're very politically minded, they're very socially aware of all the pressing systemic issues that are facing Americans. And so I think it's generally just an American mindset of every generation to want to have a subset of people that want to give back with the strengths that they can bring to the table.
Being in the military, one aspect of the military that has to always be present is the fact that there is a concern of violence, right? That's something that the military does, is it keeps us safe from that violence to the citizens. How does that inform your world? Because I mean, we hope that not everyone has to think that way, right? But some people do, and it protects us. It keeps us safe. So how does having the knowledge that, violence, danger is easily out there, uh, that's not something that everybody has present in their mind all the time. But being in the military, I imagine to some degree you're thinking about that and being aware of what threats are out there. How has that shaped your world view?
Yeah, I think violence is a byproduct of deeper um, misunderstandings between communities and between those who have and those who want. Um, and I think when it comes down to it, so much of it can be distilled in some way into behavioral science, into the unit economics of thinking. Um, and once again, having been, one of the books that fundamentally changed my world when I was very young, entering high school, was reading. Arguably, at the time, I thought it was the most boring book, but then as I got into it, I thought the most fascinating book. It was a shortened version of, basically, if you've read Gun, Germs, and Steel, but
Mm.
it's a book called The World That Trade Created, and I equate it to be a shortened version of Gun, Germs, and Steel. But it taught me a lot about how the world came together through commerce, through religion, through military, through disease, and through art. And, violence is just a byproduct of the world coming together, people wanting certain things, and people leveraging violence as a tool to achieve what they want. Um, when I look at how in certain parts of my life I have to deal with violence, and in the military, we have something called controlled violence, which is essentially how do you harness that warrior energy to deliver, but sometimes to also receive violence, and how to overcome the enemy, um, through certain tactics. It has been something that, unfortunately, I'm glad most Americans don't experience. Unfortunately, some Americans do. And when I think of violence, honestly, I also think about the street crime that still exists in our everyday communities, um, the brutalities that exist from systemic racism that still is being, still clearly affecting our communities. And so when I think of violence, I don't just think about the violence that's out there abroad. I also think about violence that young children have to grow up around, both domestically in their household, but also in their communities. And so, it's very sad. I wish I could live in a world that has reduced violence. Um, and I feel the immense respect for people that have to deal with it, whether it's social workers to first responders, in terms of being able to help people navigate through those brutal realities that still exist.
What were you doing while you were in the military?
So I'm an infantry officer by occupational specialty. I spent my first years in the infantry. I deployed back in 2012 as part of my first deployment. And then I had a very fortunate event where my military career, specifically in the reserves, often tracked, and I was very lucky that it tracked with my civilian occupation. And so I became a diplomat later, and that led me to fill a foreign affairs officer role, where I was stationed in Japan with the Army. Simultaneously, I was in Taiwan, serving with the State Department. And then afterwards, I transitioned into a technology role when I was at a venture fund, where one of the senior investors at that fund tapped me on the shoulder to join this new Army unit that was being stood up to help modernize the Army, but as reservists. And so I've been currently as a technology scout and also squadron commander leading all of tech scouting and innovation activities here for the Army Reserves in the Silicon Valley Bay Area region.
Oh, so you're still currently
I'm
in the
still in. Yeah,
military?
I've had
Oh, okay. I
close
didn't
to
realize
14
that.
years. Yeah, I have close to 14 years of service. 11 of those years are commissioned as an officer, and I'm a major currently as my rank.
Okay. Yeah, so you're even busier than I realized. So the you mentioned becoming a diplomat, and it brings up a question that I had wanted to ask. Perfect timing is there's a saying of when you learn a different language, your world expands. Do you agree with that statement? And do you have any thoughts on that? Was that your experience?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate where I had an accelerated career path where I didn't have to go through the language training. But that didn't mean I didn't study other languages. I've always been curious about the world, and so I completely agree with that statement. Sometimes the best way to understand how people feel, think, and what shapes their cognitive and emotional development is through language, because I think language, and it's very much the oral tradition as well, are formative, hand me down or passed down, if you will, of generational links of where these people came from and where these people ended up. And so I was very fortunate to already speak Mandarin Chinese and to read and write at a level that was competent and for a diplomat to be posted overseas and to operate there. I also minored in Russian studies in college, and actually was also president of the Slavic National Honor Society in high school. I went to a magnet program, and once again, I think the public school system was one of the fundamental things that changed my life, introducing me to a bigger world. But also, back to your point, Chinese being bilingual was also a fundamental driver in terms of knowing that my world is much bigger than what I knew of at the time in the bubble in Texas.
So let's go to what you do now. Can you just give a basic descriptor of it? You I mean, you've been to a lot of places, and now you've kind of decided to concentrate locally, correct?
Yeah. So, I joined the city out of the pandemic to give back to my community. I've known of San Jose and the awesome things that Mayor Sam Liccardo has done throughout the years in terms of democratizing access to technology and the benefits of that technology. And so, he's always been a champion of equity, of inclusion, access. And sometimes stood up against the big corporate powers such as the telcos and the ISPs when it came to the FCC and a lawsuit that we had with them in terms of the rollout of 5G and where do cities have a voice in. And so my role is that I lead tech and innovation here in the mayor's office. I'm the chief innovation officer for the city. We are essentially a futures unit that looks slightly ahead of the curve in terms of what's coming next and how to best prepare our cities for that. Simultaneously, we are in charge of figuring out the best ways to democratize the benefits of technology for all of our residents to improve their livelihoods, opportunities, and ultimately city experiences. And so, since I've been here, we have raised close to $4 million in civic tech and digital divide initiatives for our community. We built up the team from 4 to 40 and we went from more policy program management oriented to almost entirely technical. We've built out and executed along my vision of building better basics as a smart city by taking a hard look in terms of what our residents actually need from a technology oriented city, aka smart city. And that was really executing on 3 pillars of better data science. And actually we built our very first data science team in the city to improve data-driven operations and transparency and accountability. The second pillar was on improving digital product experiences and rapidly deploying and launching more software products to solve pressing issues in our community. And then the third is looking at our wireless connectivity infrastructure and thinking also about our IoT capabilities.
Wow, I was right with my original thesis that you were busy.
Yeah, we try to stay busy.
Earlier you were talking about guns, germs, and steel and history. Do you feel like studying history makes you a better futurist?
Um, I don't really, I don't disagree with the term futurist or disagree with studying history. I
Mm.
think curiosity is what really, you know, I care less about people being a futurist. I care more about people having a curious mind. So, for instance, like when we hire here, right, we obviously want to hire for diversity, equity, inclusion. That's a big tenet because I fundamentally believe that drives better collective intelligence and perspectives and thought processes. But also the things we look for is grit in terms of because this city is hard to navigate. Working for a political office is even harder, and so we push our teammates to work hard. So don't expect a 9 to 5, and so you got to have grit and having someone be able to say fundamentally I disagree with you and to be able to stand your ground on that. Um, and then the third is that curiosity aspect. It's having an expeditionary mindset in terms of being curious of the world, never being bored. Like, right, if you're someone that is able to be bored on a weekend, when you have all the resources to you through a laptop, or you're in Silicon Valley and you can just go have coffee chats with people and learn about what other people are doing, building, seeing. And if you still find yourself bored because you're not pursuing any of those activities, then you're probably not a good suit, suited for this team. And so we need to naturally have that expeditionary mindset of curiosity for the world and for technology and how things work. And so that's usually kind of what we hire for. And so it's not so much a study of history, but more so a curiosity for the world and how things work and why it matters.
I'm a huge fan of the word extrapolation,
Mhm.
uh, and to me, a big part of being able to see what could be or see how things could be better is extrapolation. And I don't think to me that a fundamental ingredient of the ability to extrapolate is curiosity because you have to want to look into
Mhm.
a random cubby hole uh, to get a new piece of information.
Mhm.
You can't do that without some sort of desire. Yeah, I think it's critical.
Yeah, I think extrapolation is an interesting way to put it. I think someone else put it pretty well too in terms of original thinking is Professor Adam Grant,
Mm.
who I think wrote the book Originals, or I forgot what the title of the book is. But Adam Grant, talked about the sort of insider outsider um, idea, which is when you look at the histories of certain successes in, let's say, you know, I don't know, the show Seinfeld, how many people basically wanted to not even pursue it beyond its original pilot because it didn't fit the mold of what they thought success was based off of their historical understanding and being deep insiders. And then here comes this other person that was not into the sitcom area or not, and then be able to say, like, I see the potential in this because, I come from a different segment of television, but at the same time, I'm an outsider to your specific field. And so there's like this insider outsider mentality that I think is really important, where you have just enough nuanced understanding and grasp of how things work and why they work the way they do, but a completely fresh perspective, having had an entirely different experience to then see the relevance and see just slightly into the future, and, extrapolate, if you will, of what the potential, 10x, 100x opportunities can be. And I think it's really important to have that sort of insider outsider intersection of thought. So a lot of times it requires people to have breadth of experience, but not so broad where they actually just, were basically tourists in those areas, but more so that they were actually operational, hands-on, and were able to gain some tangible perspectives in terms of how things work and why they work the way they do, whether they are institutions uh, that have been there, to processes, to also thinking about, obviously, technology stacks, and why does a certain technology work the way it does.
So I'm taking a guess here. I don't know if this is the right route to go yet, but this is my guess. Like I want to talk about where we could explore next with cities, and what technologies we do want to move towards. But I'd love to open that because I suspect this is a thing that you have to think about within a city. Is Could we talk about finite games versus infinite games?
Yeah, and we can talk about finite versus infinite games. I'm a big fan of that author, and I think a lot of what he writes about has direct application in terms of how people should run organizations and think
Yeah.
strategy.
Yeah, so could you just like give a little quick summary of what those two things are, and then and this is where my guess is, where might infinite games be important? Why might they be important to how a city functions?
Yeah, I think the best comparison of that mindset of thinking with cities is, I think cities often, so there's a couple of things, right? At least in my tech and innovation field. Um, One is, there's these benchmarkings that exist in terms of, oh, number one smart city, or, GovTech does several of these um, rankings that people, care a lot about in terms of their careers and reputations and within their circles of people that they know. Um, I think the other part is, unfortunately, thinking about budget limitations all the time, and the implications of those budget limitations, because I think, at least here in a California city, often budgets are one of the most painful issues that cities have to deal with. And, pre-pandemic, we were almost going to be net positive on our budget, and we went back into the red because of the pandemic. The state of California was actually going to be in a surplus before the pandemic, and that was the projected fiscal condition before the pandemic happened. Um, and I think the third is political and election cycles, and how that plays into things. And so I think often what happens is then, people tend to have to optimize for the short term wins in terms of how they are incentivized in their roles, and quite frankly, how the system works. Obviously, if we were to be able to take an infinity mindset to, one, be able to draw out timeline horizons at the very least. Two, to be able to think more broadly beyond just, rankings between cities, to think beyond ideological biases that say this is bad, that is good, and to have less of a binary approach to political ideology would be important. And I think the third is to really then also distill and simplify exactly what is the one or two metrics you really want to target that measure, hey, I've accomplished something or not. And so when I look at kind of my role, and the mayor that I work for, I think if I were to take an affinity mindset, I would say, look, Silicon Valley, being the largest city in Silicon Valley here, we should produce a tremendous amount of wealth. We've produced a tremendous amount of life-changing technologies, um, and we have a tremendous amount of talent. But yet we still have inequality that exists in our backyard. So if I were to say, like, why don't we have a 50 plus year plan, if you will, to say, I want to have 1% poverty rate, period. And I think that would be pretty interesting when you then think about, okay, if you reduce the poverty rate to just 1%, how would you have reduced housing access? How would you reduce the digital divide access problems? How would you reduce homelessness and health access to healthcare, and all these problems that continuously to plague cities, especially across California? Um, I would love for someone to take a bold stance and say, this is how we're going to do it in the long run. This is how we're going to do intergenerational and intragenerational mobility. And here's how we're going to leverage our national champions right in our backyards to be able to accomplish that.
So I imagine that to some degree, the digital world makes that much more possible,
It,
because you can iterate so much more quickly and you're so
well,
much more scalable. Does it?
it does and it doesn't, right? I think some of these, in the end, a lot of these problems aren't created by technology. You know, uh, the obviously there's the argument that the tech industry has created a uh, a, a gap in wealth and have nots and housing prices and access to housing, right? But largely, these are not technology created problems. And I think the barriers to solving these are also not technology problems. I think so much of them are institutional. They are being ruthlessly aligned on a common objective, and figure out really what you want to measure in terms of achieving those objectives. And then on top of that, look, you have to take into account a lot of different voices, how people want to approach things, what do they actually want to solve, how do they want to go about solving, who do they want to partner with. And I think that's where we have a lot of then misalignment that then happens. Um, and so, yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of these things are beyond my ability to influence from a tech and innovation hat, because so many things are systemic that technology is there to support. When you think about the digital divide, when you think about the fundamental drivers of poverty, for instance, and how the digital divide plays into that, I think of poverty as being driven fundamentally by, lack of access to education, to healthcare, um, to institutional barriers that might be systemic and related to social justice. And then I would also tack in there physical safety, the ability to survive beyond your childhood, right? And so when you think about those four things, often what's underwritten a lot of that now, especially in a post-pandemic world, is technology access, especially when it comes to access to education, healthcare, whether it's telehealth or ed tech, or just being able to stream YouTube and find content that could be inspirational and triggers an interest in a kid that they otherwise would never have come across. And so, um, technology is definitely an underlying platform that these issues, these key drivers of poverty, sit on top of. But ultimately, technology can only go so far into solving that. But on the flip side of it, the tech industry has been very creative consistently on coming up with new business models, new operating models. And I think that's really the power of creativity when you inject into a business model technology that accelerates that business model or expands the capabilities of that operating model. I think that's where it's powerful. And that's where I think government can most benefit. And that's why we've been focused on building better basics as a smart city, which is really focused on injecting technology in the right places to best deliver services and to create transparency and to ultimately drive some lasting changes inside City Hall before we leave.
Digital divide it's a really compelling phrase, first of all. But I mean, me being the beneficiary of so many digital things, I mean, it definitely resonates. It's like, you have so many more options once you have that access. How do you bridge the digital divide?
Yeah, I think it really depends on who you ask. And once again, it's which geographic location you're in. I think the digital divide is very different. Americans, roughly 30 to 40 million Americans suffer from the digital divide. Some numbers as high as 50. And it's if you're talking about rural America and the access to internet in general, let alone broadband, is very different than a big city where the access is much more different, determined less by infrastructure and middle mile concerns, and ultimately that will drive down costs for the users, but more so just on economic barriers. Whether that's access to be able to afford low cost internet plans, even at $10 a month, especially with high cost of living standards that exist in some of the bigger cities, to thinking about access to devices that are often now in shortage, but also simply sometimes economically unattainable. There's always a shortage, or the device is just not fitting the user's needs, the ones that they get for free from various charities or local government. And then the third is digital literacy. And that's just having a safe and equitable experience online so that, and also you can see the tangible benefits of being connected. And so when we think about the digital divide, we think about it in those in that three-legged stool problem, which is, it starts with connectivity and its devices, and ultimately digital literacy is the final stool.
That's a big project. Are you guys attacking all three of those at the moment? And I mean, is that attackable?
Yeah, so we are. For one, on the connectivity side, we've done multiple things. We've built out our community Wi-Fi project that was accelerated during the pandemic due to federal funding. We connected up to 100,000 residents to community Wi-Fi for free. We plan on connecting another 200,000 residents to free community Wi-Fi. The second part is, we've created unique public-private partnerships where we're able to sit and bring both the government as well as the telcos to the same table and say, look, I love for you to build out your 5G networks, small cell antennas in these areas that are less affluent, but really important if you think about digital redlining from an infrastructure perspective for wireless connectivity. And so they've been willing to play ball with us and build them out in areas that are not nearly as affluent that they normally would just focus on affluent neighborhoods, right? And we were able to do that because now talking about the digital literacy front, because we launched this public-private partnership called the San Jose Digital Inclusion Fund, which essentially produces roughly about $1 million worth of grants to fund community-based organizations that go out in the community, find people who are digitally divided, educate them about low-cost internet plans, ensure that they're connected, get them access to a device, and ultimately, most importantly, educate them through a digital literacy curriculum and ultimately test that learning. And so that's one of our flagship projects to really teach and build sustainable bridges across that digital divide. And then on the device access side, we've done two things. First, we piloted a device refurbishment partnership where we contract with large corporations that are willing to donate their entire digital assets, hardware assets, excuse me, from refurbished devices that their employees no longer need, or an employee leaves a company, they buy a new computer. What happens to that old computer? Well, we take all those devices, take it to a benefits corporation, a B Corp partner called Revivin, who then either refurbishes it for free for us or sells it on the market, and we get roughly about $100 back for that device plus 10% of whatever revenues they get on top of that. And then we go out and buy a new device for a family. And so that flips the model entirely upside down, because cities originally, when they got donated devices, they would pay a refurbisher $150 to $200 to get it refurbished. And when I saw that model, I was like, well, that's just stupid. I might as well go buy a new device with the amount of money that I'm paying someone else for. So at that point, we found a new partner that was willing to give us a much better deal. And that's what we've been piloting to bring device gaps down in our community. And hopefully, each corporate partner brings on roughly about $100,000 to $200,000 in revenue a year for us to go out and buy new devices. And so that's what we're projected to do with each corporate partner that signs on. So we've had ServiceNow. We have another major tech company that's in the process of signing on board as well. So we're really excited to sign on 2 to 3 more by the end of this year. And then the second part of the device gap is also ensuring that folks know how to use their devices appropriately. So we launched also a tech support pilot. That's basically a hotline manned by our high school students that are trained by IEEE professionals. IEEE is one of the largest tech nonprofit and professional organizations out there in the tech community, and they partnered with us to basically take tech professionals, train them, train our youth on IT skills, who then provide tech support to our community members that receive help on digital inclusion. And that ensures that folks don't fall back into the digital divide after receiving help and a device.
That's amazing. That's really cool. I'm going to go back to big picture for a second. You mentioned the phrase smart city. Can you just say, like, what is that idea, and like what is that idea now, and what do you see that idea being moving forwards?
Yeah, our version of a smart city, I think the smart city concept came out of even as far back as like the 1980s at the advent of the ICT movement or boom, information communication technology boom, back in the 80s and 90s, where you have obviously a burgeoning IT industry, where, with personal computing and enterprise computing like that, that really brought forth an advent of, I think, the initial sort of digitization wave of industries, right? And part of that was cities, and cities adopting, let's say, computers, and cities. So and eventually cities adopting, internet. And so with that being said, I think often smart cities can equate to a lot of things, but the way I look at it is just like it's a technology-oriented city. It is a city that is able to leverage technology to create better experiences, and better service delivery and better communication for their residents. And ultimately, to do that, I we what we thought was that you needed 3 pillars to be built out. And that's where we came up with the Building Better Basics vision. One of them is data science, which is, in order, you have to be data driven as a city. Therefore, that's kind of the brain, if you will, of the city. The second part is digital product experiences, which becomes sort of the eyes, ears, nose, mouth of the city in terms of bidirectional communication with our residents and service delivery. And then the third is the wireless connectivity side, which is sort of, and plus IoT, which sort of becomes the rest of that nervous system of the city that feels what's going on. It brings the entire city from a sensory perspective together. And that's how we define sort of the three pillars, if you will, that put together our version of building better basics as a smart city.
Can we talk about the people that would get nervous about these ideas? Because
Yeah.
there's so much here that's, to me, extremely optimistic. I mean, in general, I feel incredibly optimistic about these things. But I mean, what's the TV show that got popular recently? Black Mirror, I think it was. There's a lot of dystopian versions of this that a lot people like to bring to mind, and it's what's the funniest version of this? Oh yeah, we all thought that eventually visual surveillance would come to mind, or come to be pass at some point. And then recently, I found out that we've managed to get visual surveillance in the city of Austin with scooters, which for some reason I think that's hilarious, because it's like, here's this like delightful little go-go machine, and we've managed to get mostly citywide surveillance through that. And for a lot of people, this is an extremely uncomfortable idea. What are your thoughts on it? what's the scary version of this? Because I think there's a scary version of everything. And how do we prevent that? What's the likelihood of the scary version of that playing out?
Well, I think fundamentally we need to ask ourselves, is government bad?
Mm.
Right. And so this all starts on the premise that government, if it has these tools, will abuse the power, and therefore then government is bad. Right. And then the other part, then we need to think about then what if a corporation does it?
Mhm.
But by the way, all these corporations do have all your data.
Yeah.
They have more data than the government does. And in fact, they have a better ability to hire, retain, or attract, hire, and retain talent that can do infinitely more with that technology and that data than the government can. They just might not have the mandate to do it to that level of scariness that people think about. But there's really nothing stopping them. And if anything, they are the reasons that this is here in the first place. Right. And so I think there's obviously a question that citizens and residents have, which is, am I comfortable with the data, with the government having this data? But am I also comfortable with a company having this data? And I don't think people have delineated that. And I've seen studies where people are more comfortable with a company than with government. And I think in the end of it, it also comes down to, people slightly being, there's an emotional component, right, of trust and the feeling of safety. But there's also a very logical component, which is, do they think the government it's necessary for the government to have this data versus giving this data to Amazon and giving immediate service satisfaction and satisfaction in your own pocketbook. So I think that's the fundamental issues. Look, like one of the first things when I came to the city was I was shocked that we didn't have a digital privacy policy. So within the first 4 or 5 months, we underwent a digital privacy policy. We undertook a digital privacy policy work and ultimately got it passed within 6 months of me being part of the city. As a first measure to ensure that we have safeguards that are policies and not just values based, that ensure protections and governance around data and privacy for our residents. The second part is that we ensure that this institution is serious about it to the point where we're going to put skin in the game, and hire a first digital privacy officer, which we are in the process of hiring for. And so those are the first sort of two things that needed to happen when I saw what needed to be done as we think about just embarking in the issues related to data, digital products, and connectivity. But to your point of, a Black Mirror world, I think anything is possible, unfortunately. I don't think it's necessarily driven by government. I feel like, if anything, a lot of those environments will first be pioneered by companies. And so I think people should be more concerned about, which is, what are you opting in and out of? What are your user agreements? And I think people need to be more concerned about their privacy with companies than they do actually with government, because most of the government technologies that we procure are also, by the way, from other companies. Very few times will we build our own technology products, which my team does do. But once again, we also build on platforms of other companies, whether it's borrowing from open source to even some of the programming languages out there, to the dev environments out there. In the end, we have to very much depend on industry for a lot of these things, or nonprofit organizations.
Just to be clear, like, my stance on this is, I'm very much in the direction of, these things are happening. And when something is happening, you should go towards it and learn how to deal with it and understand it. I'm definitely not asking these questions from an attacking framework here.
No, I don't sense that. It's important for people to push us, right? Like I was just on another panel with several of the big tech companies, including NVIDIA, hosted by Berkeley. And the one thing that I wanted to drive home was like, look, push government to be better,
Yeah.
or push government to push corporations to be better, right?
Yes.
Users can only do so much, and government is the ultimate checks and balances that should be fighting for their residents, for their citizens. And so it's important that people are mindful of these issues, and it's important that people push, because guess what? Companies might not listen when it comes to these things that do not directly benefit, uh, customer satisfaction, or retention rates, or their LTV CAC ratios, right? Like, but guess what? Government will care. Your electeds will care, um, and that's kind of your check against corporates, is to balance the power of government.
Do you so like you mentioned it being, kind of the final check, and I'm wondering if also you said that, people are often more frightened by the idea of government having the data than a corporation having the data in some cases. And do you think maybe that has something to do with the concept of what is it? Monopoly on violence. So the idea being societies often give over power of violence to the government because it's such a difficult thing. It's a problematic thing when violence is authorized for everyone, and that's given over to the government as kind of one of its final arbitration powers. And the idea of giving up something else to the same entity that has that specific final say is frightening. Do you think it could be something like that? Like, I'm just curious where that discomfort comes from, or is it just
Yeah.
because of
Oh,
science fiction novels,
no,
which
I
it could
agree.
be?
There's definitely, I think, that as an underlying factor, right? Which is like this, um, gender army or Gestapo type of situation, right? Where your domestic law enforcement is supercharged by technology,
Mhm.
um, and goes a little bit too unchecked, to say the very least. But I would say the other part is also, I think, just the government needs to do a better job of educating folks on how it uses technology, why it uses technology, putting the benefits up front for, hey, if I have your data, this is what I'm going to use it for. This is how I'm going to retain it. This is how I'm going to protect it. This is how I'm going to store it, right? This is how I'm going to share it or not share it. Um, and I think there needs to be better education around that by government. I think, unfortunately, though, when you look at government, we're usually not, especially local government, we're not usually the ones buying ads. And so, I've heard the statistic out there that 40% of most of funds raised, especially at B2C startups these days, go to Google and Facebook. There's so
Okay.
much crowding out of noise in what people are bombarded with in terms of content, paid content, that often think, where does government fit in? And so the opportunity for government to actually engage with a resident, or with a consumer, is very low, especially in these spaces where actually it's really important for us to better educate folks. But often it doesn't come through. If you look at influencers, how many influencers are out there aside from elected officials that are actually talking about how government works? What does this do? Why does this exist? How does this function? There aren't a whole lot of people doing that. I can name one guy, who's actually used to work for San Jose's Department of Transportation, who's kind of a mini TikTok influencer, talking about different transportation planning and city planning, and how there is also certain issues that relate to racism in terms of prior city planning plans that impact resource allocation in lower income communities of color. And that's been interesting, but there isn't a whole lot of folks that are bridging that gap.
Yeah, the incentive structures just aren't really set up for it.
It's
Um,
not set up for it. Your budgets aren't set up for it. You know,
Yeah.
the entire system is, I think, antiquated
Yeah, I mean, we do need
or
people with a
antiquated.
vested interest in how their community functions. We do
Yeah,
need
and
that.
I think government needs to do a better job of meeting people where they are. I know during the pandemic, there was the and I'm butchering this Spanish word, the Primadores programs, where people would work with local community promoters to better get messaging out, especially in the Latino community. That was a big issue, especially when fighting disinformation, misinformation. Um, whether it's on testing, whether it's on vaccines, whether it's on other benefits, social benefits that they could receive if they were impacted by COVID. Um, and so I think governments learned some of those ways, but at the same time, I think we can do a much better job. Like companies, their whole focus sometimes is meeting customers where they are, and that's the best way to improve their LTV CAC, right? And so, how can government think about how to improve? Well, define what their LTV CAC ratio is for a resident, and how can they improve upon that, or an
Could you
NPS
explain
score.
what that is real quick?
Yeah, long-term value over customer acquisition cost. And so basically it takes into consideration like basically the overall revenue potential coupled with retention rates of what your customer is, and then you basically account then for how much you spend to acquire a customer. And so that's essentially, and plus churn, and that's essentially how you arrive at this magical ratio that all the VCs look at. But I think ultimately, government should really look at, hey, what is my sort of LTV CAC ratio? What are my metrics to determine, am I benefiting my residents ultimately? Am I delivering a service? Am I delivering experience that is meaningful to them, that is beneficial to them, that addresses the value prop that they want? And I think it's hard, right? Because this is why people are pursuing charter cities. This is why people, some folks are taking it out into the seas to build their own cities and governments and sovereignties. And part of that is because government is essentially a monopoly. And unless you are, by, you have multiple citizenships and multiple passports that you carry, you're usually limited to one. And people need in this current civilization, human civilization in this period of time, people need to be affiliated with at least one of the monopolies, or else you don't exist, more or less, and you can't travel, right? So, um, I think that's the curse of a monopolistic system, is that then are you fully bringing value to your customers versus serving yourself and
Do you
maintaining
feel
that
that we
monopoly?
should do you feel that we should move from the monopolistic system of government?
I don't think we should. I don't want to say that, because
Okay.
I feel like the far end of that is anarchy, right? In a
True.
pure
Yeah,
competition
you go
environment.
far enough. Yeah.
Yeah, in a pure competition environment, that's or a perfect competition environment, that's basically anarchy. But I think there needs to be some healthy balance where I think we need to do better. But I wouldn't even dare say would an oligopoly achieve some better results. It's just um, I don't have an answer for that. But what I can say is the burden is on government to serve their people better. I would love for cities, I know small and medium-sized cities think about this, to compete for residents. And the funny thing is you have some big cities that don't want more residents. They don't want to get bigger. They don't want more people living here. It's a funny thing. Like you go to some cities in the Bay Area, they don't want more people moving here. They want people to move out, right? And so it's like a very interesting dynamic. And
That's
you got other
confusing
mayors.
to me.
It is very confusing, right?
I mean, I get it from like a top level perspective, but even like getting it, I have like a fundamental confusion when I hear you say that. There's just like some instinctual, that sounds funny.
Yeah, it does. Um, and so these are all the kind of dynamics that you have to balance. And, as leading tech and innovation here, I have to balance that, because I have to put my own views aside and
Yeah.
say, okay, why do residents care about this or are for this or against this? And then ultimately, where do we draw the line? What role do we play in, if we have any role to play in?
So I'll ask one last dark question. I asked the typical dark questions of what happens with tech, but you have a much more boots on the ground situation where you're really actively doing this stuff. To you, what are the more legitimate threats of the digital world that you're, close to dealing with now that you see coming in the future?
Yeah, I think my biggest threat right now in the immediacy is related to cyber, and uh, and I think the psychographics that are involved with cyber in terms of gaining access to a ton of user behavior data,
Do
PII,
you mean cybersecurity?
cybersecurity.
Okay,
Yeah.
just
And
making sure.
so having a national or a state or non-state actor, but most definitely a state actor is the bigger threat, that has an absolute understanding or enough understanding of your population in terms of how to really model and shock your system uh, through cyber tools and information dominance tools is what scares the living crap out of me. Or excuse me, information warfare tools is what scares me. And so when you think about, let's say, the T-Mobile hack, right, where there's 50 million user accounts hacked, um, when you think about all these major companies, from healthcare to government, including schools, to it's going back far back as the OPM hack, the Office of Personnel Management hack, and over a decade ago now. These are all huge, rich nuggets of opportunity for nations to better understand the American people at a very deep level. And then so when then you think about injection of information warfare and thinking about multi-domain um, engagements with your competitors, it always does not require raising the rifle, because there are so many things you can do before raising a rifle that can debilitate your enemy, to the point where when they do raise a rifle, they're firing not nearly as effectively as they should be. And that is always interesting when you start taking the infinity game mindset in terms of long-term dominance over another individual or another country.
Yeah, that's scary.
That's my immediate, because I don't think people care enough about cyber. I hate to say it, especially from a
Mhm.
consumer perspective. And I don't think people care enough about privacy or are educated enough. And they definitely do not know enough about data governance and how their data is being used. And then more than that, I think they're pretty desensitized to things being hacked.
Yeah.
And most people also, even if they identify misinformation or disinformation content, whether it's locally generated or foreign generated, injected, or foreign encouraged, they're not really thinking about it in terms of, I should report this. They're just like, oh, this is weird. And often I think a lot of it goes unreported, just ignored. And it just takes a few to keep spreading it. Just takes a few to sink in. So
Is the solution? Does the
the
solution go
solution,
back to education, or
I
is
think
it
it
something else?
always, I mean, in some ways it does go back to education. I think, uh, I think there could be a lot more done on education. I think it's also education and reinforcement learning, creating tools, and it's on government. And so, like, there are great companies out there. I'm not going to name their names, but they've created sort of like tools for people to, better check their Wi-Fi. And so if they leave their Wi-Fi on, it warns you that you left your Wi-Fi on for your phone, for instance. Two, if you're connecting to untrusted network, it informs you of that. And it has a list of all, for instance, all the nefarious Wi-Fi networks that are out there. But three, it trains you to think a little bit more carefully about all your different connections uh, to wireless connectivity sources, so that you can be better aware of, you can maintain better awareness of that situation. And it basically says, look, you've received ideally some education that says these are the right ways of doing things, these are the wrong ways, and this is why. And then ultimately you have applications that support that learning to better remind you of the things that you learned. And I think often, even in companies, right, we go through, um, you'll go through, like, I don't know, your privacy awareness or cybersecurity policy training, you might get a talk, you might do an online class, you might do a little gamified course, and that's it. And you go on your day. But wouldn't it be great if you had actual reinforced learning? And I know there's some companies that do that. They're like, hey, we pretend to mock call you up and be like, try to get your password, to create socially engineered attacks, to, red teams that do like phishing emails on purpose, but I don't think it's enough. And I think sometimes it just requires daily adherence to, like, this is just kind of how you need to live your life these days. I hate to say it, but when I grew up in the community I did, you always made sure that when you walked or drove home, that you weren't being followed.
Yeah, that's pretty standard.
And
Yeah.
and you had to, because
Yeah.
people will follow you home. They will follow you home if they like the car that you drove. So unfortunately, online, where nobody's really thinking about that at that level.
Yeah.
And that's just the world we live in.
A couple of years ago, or maybe not a couple, I don't know, a while back, maybe 2 years ago or something, I got like $1,000 in Bitcoin stolen from me.
Oh,
And
wow.
within like 2 months, I was so grateful that I had gotten that money stolen from me. Because I was like, oh man, I would have just waited and not learned any of the security that I need to know. Like I wouldn't have learned any of it. And it's like that was a low price. That was a really low price I paid.
Yeah.
It's better to get educated and yeah, you're right. There's certain things of every environment that become I don't know, no-brainers, where it's like, yeah, you look before you cross the road. You make sure that nobody's following you when you come home. And it's like, yeah, we wish that we could live in a world where that weren't the case, but we do. And people have to take measures to take care of themselves. Well,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I published an op-ed a while back called in the Hill called Securing Our Digital Sidewalks. And I very much so still stand by that term, that we need to do better in educating, but also creating reinforcement learning measures to secure our digital sidewalks. And it starts at the consumer/resident level. And it's up to government to do better education around there.
Okay, so I've asked you about the dark questions. What's some of the most exciting stuff to you about what can happen right now digitally?
Yeah, I think the most exciting piece, is really thinking about coming out of the pandemic, the amount of opportunities and focus on digital health and ed tech has really spurred some interesting waves where I think I see a lot of folks, both in the investor side as well as companies, looking at how do I go beyond just my limited TAM of high willingness to pay, but a very niche sort of user segment, right? And so these are companies or investors that have, made some decent money, or the companies themselves have found product market fit already, or they're looking to back the next generation entrepreneurs and founders who are saying, I'm willing to address a wider audience that are suffering from XYZ conditions, that might have less access to healthcare consistently, or maybe, on the education side, have less willingness to pay opportunities versus those who are able to afford very high end, both education and offline, um, platforms, right, including private schools and tutors. And so what you're seeing is this explosion of democratizing what inherently always separated sort of the haves and the have-nots in terms of mobility, economic mobility. Education, as I mentioned, was always a fundamental driver. So is healthcare, and ensuring quality of life as well as just survivability. And so you're starting to see a lot of focus towards expanding that TAM to a broader population. I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about that direction because I think that is kind of where we need to go. It's no different than you see in the consumer space when it comes to, let's say, performance materials, right, for athletes, or the the Lululemons of the world, right, in terms of the price points that they were selling at, and then slowly democratizing just the access to those type of materials and designs to all athletes, or aspiring athletes of all body shapes, color, size, gender, and age, um, through democratizing it either through different brands or that meet similar needs. And but it starts with kind of proofing it out and then expanding that access. And I'm starting to see that here, in specifically in healthcare and education as well, which I'm really passionate about. That you often see in B2C as sort of like the phase two of any product, going from a higher willingness to pay early adopter, first mover population to a wider part of that uh, adoption, or crossing the innovation chasm, part of that curve, if you will. So I'm really excited about that, to be honest. That's one of my bigger things. More long term, I'm really excited about electric vertical takeoff and landing. I'm really, really excited about that in terms of, obviously there's a lot of benefits there. From everybody's talking about the total addressable market size, in terms of, I think it was like some people quoted like $1 trillion opportunity to, obviously noise and less fossil fuel use, pollution related to that. But my biggest thing is redefining urbanization trends and really rethinking where do people need to live and work and how people need to stay in touch with each other. And then do we need to lay physical infrastructure in such a fixated long-term way versus having vertiports? And the vertiports are going to come in heavy at first, but the goal is to one day, I think, have more mobile modular vertiports. And then on the city side, as I think about this, is like, okay, if there is infrastructure coming, how do I democratize that infrastructure so that it democratizes the economic developments that happen with these new hubs of transportation? But simultaneously, how do I do it in an integrated fashion with other cities and smaller cities and where other people might live coming in and out of? And the third, how do I ultimately democratize access to these new air mobility services, so that all residents can fly in them and take advantage of that? I think that would be really cool. So I'm really excited for that, both on obviously the climate change aspect, the introduction of new emerging technologies, but then also thinking about the socioeconomic impacts that we need to get ahead of.
Those are both, I agree, super exciting. It's interesting now that I've been, playing so much with finance stuff and just I mean just one side effect of that is I'm looking at most finance apps when they come out, and I went to get a COVID test recently, and it was just, I had so many experiences where I pulled out my insurance card to hand it to someone, and I mean, first of all, she's like, we don't take that insurance, and then I'm like, wait, so why did I come all the way here? That's my first experience, and then the next one, I hand the insurance card to somebody else, and I think, wait, why wasn't that a QR code? And then I thought, well, why wasn't that a QR code on my phone?
Mhm.
And then I'm thinking, why wasn't that an app? And why didn't I have a timer that just got me here? And there's a common anecdote that people talk about is the invention of the washing machine. And they talk about the invention of the washing machine in terms of like uh, hours saved. And it was like there was just an entire subset of society that just washed clothes, and they would just they would spend I mean, it wasn't like that was all they would do all day long, but it was a significant portion of their life. You know, the walk to whatever water source you needed, and then the process of going through the washing of the clothes, and then the walk back. Like, it's a huge time commitment. And then the amount of wealth that is created by just like cutting the requirement to do that just out entirely. I feel like there's just unimaginable number of hours to be saved within the innovations available in the medical system right now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just, and it's true in government too. There's just still so much manual workflows that can be that can reduced that can reduce not only the operations and improve efficiency and obviously cost, but ultimately also improve employee satisfaction so that they can focus on best serving residents or patients, and that has a direct spillover into ultimately the resident and patient satisfaction scoring as well, and how people can be more creative, more thoughtful, uh, more engaged in their careers or their jobs.
So I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but and probably I should have asked this earlier in the interview because it could be a long one as well. But I'm curious about I got to ask the UBI question. You mentioned earlier when you were talking about you know getting network access for people, and then giving them devices, and then giving them education, and education seemed like such a critical component of that. And I mean, I think it probably all falls flat without it. And there's one common thing that's talked about in the UBI world of it's not a, what is it? It's not a logistics problem, it's a purpose problem, where like some people are of the mindset of this can already be done, but the problem is what do we do next? And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that. Is like uh do you see UBI as a direction that could be going we could be going at a national level or a city level? And if so, like what are the things to attack there?
Yeah, so I look at it more so as, I think the arguments for UBA a lot of times is still tied to redistribution of wealth.
Mm,
Um, and when you see a lot of the UBI programs out there, yeah, it's people that raise money from other philanthropic donors that are willing to put some of their percentage of their wealth to philanthropy, and instead of putting into other programs, they put into piloting UBI initiatives.
yes.
So I don't disagree with UBI. Um, we are actually in the process of launching an initiative here, um, that will democratize a certain emerging technology to create essentially a technology-driven UBI for some of our residents, to in hopes of reducing their gaps to inequality. And so it's under embargo right now, so I can't talk more about it. But it'll be pretty cool, and we'll be launching hopefully next week or two with a press release. Um, and so, yeah, I am a fundamental believer of reducing the economic barriers. And I think that's what UBI is trying to do, is to reduce some of those economic barriers that drive inequality, right? By putting money in the pockets of residents or people who need it the most, and to free them up so that they can pursue the initiatives, the initiatives they want to pursue. I think the counterbalance to that, though, is, once again, uh, you know, Professor Adam Grant has a great point where he talks about, like, hey, you had a lot of entrepreneurs. Most of them were more successful. I forgot the rates that he quoted from his research. Most of them were more successful when they maintained their day jobs, and they spent it as a side hustle, building whatever venture. And they were actually better at risk managing and de-risking things and thinking things through more carefully, being more strategic. And that was true for artists too, um, who were undertaking certain, initiatives, whether they were writing books or creating music, or painting. And so, there's no perfect model for it. But, I think the fundamental issue is let's focus more so on just solving our poverty rate first, however possible. That is that is not acceptable for us Americans, for those to look to our neighbors, to look to our fellow, uh, you know, Americans or people who want to be Americans and say, yeah, you can live in abject poverty and you can continue to have your follow-on generation live in the same abject poverty. I don't think that's acceptable. And so I think we need to do something about that. Is it redistribution of wealth? I mean, I don't really think that's the right model, but I think we can be a little bit more creative. And so hopefully the pilot that we launch here will show that it's all a business model problem injected with tech, where I can generate revenues to solve for some of those inequities without further taxing people, without raising debt, without levying fines, or charging people permits and fees. And so when you look at those 4 levers of revenues that traditionally governments have pursued, it seems like it's no different than being in the medieval times as a castle. And so I want us to break out of that castle, that medieval business model of running government, and think of creative ways that we can engage with industry to generate revenues that doesn't create a financial burden on people that are giving and people who are willing to give, and to expand the pie versus thinking wealth is only so much and we need to redistribute it. I would like to say we can create more wealth and redistribute that.
Well, I want to be conscious of your time. I know that you have to run. This has been an absolute pleasure. I think that you are working on things that are of incredible value, and it's been super fascinating to talk with you about it. So thank you so much for coming on. And is there any place you'd like to send folks online, anything like that?
Yeah, folks, feel free to, follow me on LinkedIn. It's, in my full name there with the city of San Jose. They can also follow me on Twitter at San Jose Moti. That's MOTI, Mayor's Office of Tech and Innovation. So they can follow me in both spots.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much.